Hello again, this is Earl Silverman, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Rheumatology. Welcome you back as I highlight a paper of particular interest to the readership by interviewing one of the authors of an article which will appear in the November 2022 edition of the journal. The article I picked for more in-depth exposure is part of our Panorama 360 Degrees of Rheumatology features and is entitled The Unintended Consequence of the Overturn of Roe v. Wade, Restrictions on Methotrexate Use by Dr. Bonnie Bermas. So today I have the pleasure to be speaking with Dr. Bermas of how a U.S. Supreme Court decision to limit access to abortion in the U.S., at least in some states, has affected the care of patients with rheumatic diseases. Bonnie, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to me and our listeners. So if that's all right, without further ado, we'll just start.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm quite pleased to be here today.
No, it's our pleasure. So for our non-US and most Canadians know, colleagues, what are the implications of overturning Roe v. Wade, and specifically what's changed in the US?
So Roe v. Wade guaranteed federally the right to access to abortion. And by overturning Roe v. Wade, now that that right is in the hands of the states, so it can be voted on at a state level. And as a result, currently there are 18 states that will have banned abortion at various times, some as early as 6 weeks, some at 15 weeks. But so currently there's 18 that are banned and 10 that have bans on the in the works, but it's just being held up in the court system of those particular states. So essentially what it does is really restrict access to pregnancy termination ultimately in the majority of states in the United States.
So it's a significant number of the percentage of the population then.
Yes, I mean, whether it correlates the same percentage of population, it's centrally, most of the central states, which are a little bit less populous than the coast, but nonetheless, it is going to be a significant proportion of the population.
Right. So what are the implications for practicing physician rheumatologists then?
So, as rheumatologists, the majority of our patients are reproductive age women. And we know that whether that disease is lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory arthritis or vasculitis, that pregnancy proceeds best if disease is under good control. And so we like our pregnancies to be planned, but in the United States, 50% of pregnancies are not planned. And even in the best of circumstances, there's no 100% effective contraception that is reversible. Permanent surgical contraception is, but the others are not. And so patients are always at risk of becoming pregnant, planned or not. And sometimes when patients become pregnant with significant disease activity, those pregnancies can really be at the great risk for the mother and have a poor outcome for the developing fetus. So that's one major issue, because we have at times needed to terminate pregnancy in our patients really for the maternal survival. The other issue is that many of our medications, for example, methotrexate, mycophenolate mofetil, cyclophosphamide, leflunomide, are teratogenic, and inadvertent exposure to those medications early during pregnancy can increase the risk of congenital anomalies. So that's another issue for us, because prior to the overturn of Roe v. Wade, if a patient was exposed to one of these teratogenic medications in the majority of places in the United States, you could counsel that pregnancy termination was an option, and that's no longer an option for a vast number of our patients.
So what would happen if you did, being a Canadian not exposed to this, would you be criminally liable potentially in some states for
Yeah.
suggesting an abortion?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and there's various language state by state. So for example, I live in Texas, which is one of the most restrictive states. And there's some tricky language that talks about aiding and abetting. And so really, I think currently the interpretations by lawyers that I've spoken to and other of my colleagues have spoke to, that interpretation is really, sort of saying, go here, here's the funds to do it. So I'm interpreting as I can counsel a patient that that's still an option, but just not an option in Texas. Now, one of the proposed laws on the docket for Texas is that any Texan getting an abortion anywhere will be criminal. So if someone goes from Texas to, New York to get an abortion, that Texan is still criminally liable. And how that's going to play out is really unclear for any of us. We don't know.
This is really scary stuff. I think
Sorry, I just didn't hear you.
I'm sorry. I said this is really scary for patients and the physicians. I mean,
it's extremely scary for patients and physicians. And, many of us in rheumatology have had the unfortunate experience of a patient who's either had an inadvertent teratogenic exposure, or a patient who's so sick during pregnancy that the mom's life is a danger. I mean, it's very, very scary.
And I understand my interpretation of this. It's got to be imminent danger if the state even allows it, not, oh, well, the mother's probably going to die or it's going to worsen their disease. I mean, that makes, to me, I just couldn't believe when I heard that.
Yes, that is correct. And that it becomes tricky. Who gets to make that decision? Right. None of us have a crystal ball. None of us know, right? We make always in the practice of medicine, we make our best assumption of what a risk is and a decision-making risk in real time. But yes, it's very frightening, especially as a person who focuses their practice on reproductive rheumatology and caring for patients during pregnancy. It's very frightening.
Yeah, I mean, when I keep on hearing it gets me unbelievable what's happened. And the final thing, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that in some states, and I think Texas is one of them, that in fact they encourage lay people to say somebody's getting an abortion, or sort of to rat them out, as it were.
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer, and so I don't know the nuances, but it was the way they crafted the law in Texas was exactly what you're seeing, which becomes very, very complicated. But it's lay people saying this person had an abortion. So yes.
Is there anything you want to add about how it's going to affect your practice, about rheumatologists' practice and the patients beyond what we've said?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. One of the my biggest concern is if, this piece is about methotrexate, but could have almost as easily been about something like mycophenolate mofetil. Our number one recommended evidence-based medication for inflammatory arthritis is methotrexate. And as insurance companies require a failure of methotrexate often before they'll approve a biologic. And so that's for inflammatory arthritis. And then our go-to medication for lupus nephritis is mycophenolate mofetil. And my concern is, are we as rheumatologists going to be more reticent to prescribe what is the state-of-art evidence-based go-to first-line therapeutic because of concern about potentially our reproductive age patients who are female getting pregnant, while on these medications. And it does underscore that we need to be constantly mindful of that. We need to constantly review with their patients, their pregnancy planning and their contraceptive choices if they're not planning on getting pregnant in the near future. But that I think is going to happen. I've spoken to colleagues across the country. I have one colleague where their, practice is mandating proof of contraception before prescribing medication. So it gets very tricky, and I think it's going to have an impact on the way people prescribe and care for patients, which is going to be to the detriment of our patients.
Yeah, and the other medicine as we're talking, which struck me, is ACE inhibitors, which are widely used for, number one, certainly in lupus nephritis, to decrease proteinuria, renal protective effect, et cetera, which are known teratogenic. Teratogens also.
Yeah, the ACE inhibitors are interesting because it's not so much that they're teratogenic as they cause failure of the developing kidney. So the one, not that it's great about ACE inhibitors, but the one thing you can do is early exposure in pregnancy is really not the issue that we're as concerned about as later. So with someone who's on an ACE inhibitor, they could inadvertently get pregnant. You could take them off the medication. Most times that's fine. That's very different than somebody who may have been exposed to, say, methotrexate 6, 7, 8 weeks of gestation, woman not knowing she's pregnant, where the peak organogenesis happens and the peak risk to the developing embryo occurs.
Thank you for clarifying. That's important. Anything else you'd want to add? I think I've answered all my questions.
No, I think that's all, but I thank you so much for having me today.
I think this is really important, and I hope that our listeners do note what Dr. Bermas has said, and hopefully do something about it in the United States, and support our U.S. colleagues in this fight. That's my editorial comment. So I want to thank you for taking this time and giving our listeners, I think, certainly me, insights into this dilemma that I don't think any of us would have predicted may have inadvertently come from a decision, even by the Supreme Court. In fairness to the Supreme Court of the United States, I'm sure this was not on their list of down the road consequences. So to viewers and listeners, I encourage you all to read the manuscript entitled The Unintended Consequence of the Overturn of Roe v. Wade, Restrictions on Methotrexate Use. But as stated by Dr. Bermas, it really goes beyond the use of methotrexate, basically to any known teratogen that may be used in our patients. And it's now available at the journal's website at jroom.org and will appear in the print edition of the journal in the Panorama 360 Degrees of Rheumatology section. And we'd love your comments on Twitter and JRoom or by email at manuscripts.jroom. And thank you, and hope you will listen to me again next month when I interview somebody from the December 2022 edition. Thank you.